Today I'll be talking to Jumoke Verissimo, a journalist, poet, and now an author of A Small Silence. So Jumoke, your debut novel, A Small Silence, is centered around Prof, a human rights activist who returns back home from prison, and a young woman named Desire who tries to learn out of his darkness, his self-imposed exile. What was the inspiration behind this story?
So the friend, there was this friend of mine who were in school together, and I was visiting his house in the night, at night, and we just talked. But that particular night, I'd gone to see him, and we sat down, talked about everything from personal to national and international. And we began to talk about Nigeria, and then the power went off. And as we sat down in that darkness, I just felt this overwhelming feeling of this sense that darkness meant something more. And I wanted what it means to live in the dark. To live the rest of one's life in the dark. And I told my friend that I returned to the house and I wrote that very first, it's called what turned out to be this novel. So it was that sense of interrogating the space I was in and the context of the discussions we were having at the time.
I mean, your novel is very timely considering where we are in Nigeria. We're kind of like a crossroads now, when you see how activists are being arrested once again, the notorious DSS, and protesters being shot at, how does that feel for you? I mean, you're just publishing this novel, it was just published a few months ago. So what does that do to you?
I'm not sure what it does to me, but I actually think the Nigerian narrative hasn't changed. It's just that it continues to produce different things. At this time, we're seeing more of the consequences of trauma people have faced over the years. So, using the metaphor, which actually is the focus of the book, there's that sense of the darkness, going on. So, I have this sense that we are still struggling with that space we have always been in. We're traumatized people, constantly negotiating that darkness that we're in. So, I don't know going back to your question, I don't know what to feel. I don't know if it's right to be perpetually in the dark, but I don't have a word for my feelings at this time.
Well, let's go back to the trauma. I mean, that individual trauma, that taboo topic or the other way around. You have Prof, an activist, broken, going into the darkness. We never tell the stories of these people. I feel like the victims never have a voice. Occasionally, you have, say, Shoinka, who writes his memoirs and his prison experience. But the no names. I mean, I told you yesterday, a friend of mine said he saw somebody at CMS Boston who approached him and said he'd just been released. He was a victim of June 12, and he was asking people if they could help him, if they could give him a job, And they never seem to have a voice, So why are we so scared of talking about these issues?
Oh, well, those who do trauma will say that traumatized people have no language. They lose their voice. They lose that sense of language. And what I was trying to do with Prof was just that I'm practically interested in all of those people who fought, for democracy and how they turn out. So we have a lot of activists, but we see them as heroes, right? But we don't see what becomes of them. More like how they become, what they become rather. What they become outside of being heroes. And that was what I was exploring in Prof. And I wouldn't say that quite a number of them tried to write their memoirs, but they were also, like in the course of Prof, the character of Prof is one of those who were in the forefront, who was in the front. But he was also someone who actually constantly battled being the person he wanted to be, outside of the person that the person that people see him as. And that is something we don't talk about, you know. What becomes of the heroes? What becomes of our heroes? How do they cope with their lives outside of the advocacy they push? Who are they? Who are those people? And you see that in Prof, constantly dealing with his personal lives, dealing with his troubles. He's got personal issues. He's got relationship issues. He's just human, and we don't see those things, you know. So I look at the bigger picture, but at the same time, I'm also looking at those things that we fail to concern ourselves with, and these are the things that make people, you know.
I mean, Prof returns back home, and he's forgotten. His comrades have become ministers, advisors to the president. You know, is that the fate that awaits the activists when they return back home? Those with ideals, those that want to fight for a cause. Because it kind of like, when I was reading that, I was like, wow, okay, so this is highly demoralizing, you know, and it is real as well, because we know so many people that go through that, and a lot of people that have sold out.
I don't know if it's the fate, but it's the fate of what I mean. It's not the fate of the activists, but it's what exists here at this time in our country. And I guess that's one of the things someone like Prof is battling with. He's an idealist. He has come back to that space where he felt he was trying to change the world, or trying to change the mindset of the people. But he returns to a place where nothing has changed, you know. And that in itself is demoralizing for him. And his disintegration starts from there. His mind begins to disintegrate from there. That sense of having, of being in a place where you can do nothing, you know. There's nothing worse than assuming that you have power and realizing that that power doesn't really exist. So, I wouldn't say it's the fate of the activists to return to things like that. I would say it's the context, it's the way things are, you know. And I don't know if it's possible to change that, you know. It's that inability to attempt to change things and being unable to change it. That is my own basic concern that's with the novel. That's the margin between being able to change and being unable to change things. You know, always being powerless, even when you have power. Prof has power from the perspective that people like him. They like the idea of Prof, but they don't like the person that he becomes. They don't like what they see, you know. They like the idea that Prof is someone who is an activist, who has fought for them, is the person out there. But when it comes to the streets and they see him, they do not see their hero. So he's got power in him, he's got people power, but he's powerless. So that's what I mean. So talking about what eventually becomes of the activists in that sense, it's complicated, it's complex. How do you resolve that? You know?
So let's talk about Desire, your female protagonist. She kind of hero worships Prof. They've had an encounter when she was little, and that's motivated her to also become some kind of activist and also take life and matters into her own hand. But when you see the way they engage in the dark and how she tries to learn out, you kind of have the feeling that there's that fascination and that attraction that they constantly play with, but they never quite get there where you hope they might.
Okay, you're talking about the sexual tension between them.
And not only the sexual, but amongst many things, definitely.
Oh, well, I think there's a very thin line between sexual tension and anger and frustration, actually, as well. So, yeah, that's one of the things I was trying to play with there. So, she's dealing with the past. She's dealing with the trauma of her childhood. He's dealing with the trauma that he's facing at the time, and then that from his past as well. So, there's something about things that are unspeakable. When you find no words for when you find no words for some things, it builds up this tension inside of the person, and there's this connection. And I mean, it has always fascinated me how we don't interpret this. When people are angry sometimes with themselves, they have sex. Kind of. Yeah, you've got people that are friends and all of that, and there's always a thin line between what becomes of our anger. What do we make of it? And maybe it doesn't necessarily have to lead to sex. Like, didn't lead to sex in the case between Prof and Desire, but it helps us to explore their person. So it comes back to, what do you do with it? What do you do with that thing, that tension inside of you? What do you do with the anger? What do you do with the frustration? What do you do with the grievance? All of those things, yeah.
I mean, June 12th was quite a traumatic episode in the history of Nigeria, and you were a teenager, right? Around that time, maybe probably 13, 14, thereabouts,
17.
right?
16, 17.
Excuse me?
16, 17.
16, 17. So what made you want to revisit that June 12th?
Well, I guess everybody has some memory of June 12th.
What are your memories?
Oh, well, I think I was around my mom's shop, and one of the very strong, vivid memories I hold was everybody on the streets, oh, no. I think that I'm mixing that up with the Abacha, yeah. When everybody was jubilating. Yes, I was 13, 14, yeah. I was mixing the Abacha, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I think, I think there's this thing about June 12th, which is, it's very important, and it's very relevant to if Nigeria were a person, to that sense of selfhood, the Nigerian selfhood as Nigerian person. And I find it fascinating with how it has formed that Nigerian personhood, Seeing Nigeria as a person now, how it has unraveled us, how we have begun to see who we really are, I think there's this thing June 12 did to us, which is that it brought out the beast in us, And we began it's not like we didn't know who we were, but we became familiar with our own self, So perhaps that was something that fascinated me. As a young person, I wouldn't have thought I would have dealt with it the way I did. But, you read history, you interact with people, you see how what our nation is becoming, and it's always a point of reference. It's always a point of reference. That's why I said, if we have to consider Nigeria as a person, there's that sense of how it has unraveled and what it has made of us. Yeah.
Jumoke, I know you as a poet, so you're transitioning to prose now. How was that for you? Did it come easy?
Yeah, I've done prose, for a while now, but I probably poetry, more poetry.
Yeah, more poetry. I mean, this is your debut novel, right?
Yeah, I've published a few short stories, but it just happens that my novel is coming out now, and whenever something comes out, that's its morning, you know. That's when it ought to be, right. So, I don't think I write other kind. I've been a copywriter, I've been a journalist. You can say I've dabbled into different things. But I also, if you've read the book, you'd also see that I don't leave poetry alone.
No,
you know?
not at all.
In that sense, I really believe that there's something we have to do with language, you know. So, whatever form I write in, there's always that sense of trying to make new sense of that genre, which I have tried to do here. And one of the driving points of being a poet is that you're always trying to find the in-between, you know, trying to deal with emotions, trying to deal with the unspeakable, trying to deal with the essence. And yeah, you would always find that in my writing, and you find that in my prose as well. So I'm still a poet.
So we should be expecting a collection soon?
Oh, I mean, I don't know what you should expect. I'm writing by me.
No pressure.
You're not going to put me in a spot. On the spot, yeah.
So I know you deliberately chose a Nigerian publisher and a Nigerian team, which is something quite fascinating because, I mean, everybody wants to go international, global. They're looking for those European or American publishing houses to make it big, to land in all the feuilletons. And here you are saying you want to bring it back home. It is important that it starts from home.
It's a Nigerian story. It is our story. You know, I remember when I was a teenager, Wole Oguntokun said something, and he said, we were driving home, and he said, Jumoke, do you know that there's no point if nobody knows your story outside of your home? Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with being global. I don't think, I've written poetry that you read outside of a country. But there's no point writing stories that no one reads at home, you know? So, yeah, if anybody comes to pick up the book outside of Nigeria, I appreciate that, but I think it's an important story here. Yeah.
And in terms of the editing process, because I know we spoke about that yesterday, and it was very, very important for you to work with a Nigerian editor because you felt that someone from Europe or somebody with a different background wouldn't fully appreciate what you were bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm. I'm Yoruba, and I'm immersed in that. Even if I don't, I don't write Yoruba as fluently as, and speak it as fluently as I would like to, but I take pride in trying to express that part of me. And I needed somebody who actually will understand that. So the editing process involves that going back, back and forth with someone who could see where I was coming from, you know, someone who understands that part of me that I was, not only am I trying to tell a Nigerian story, I'm also trying to emphasize how I am a part of that story, what I am in that story. So we have so many cultural groups in Nigeria, but I'm a Yoruba in Nigeria, and I'm speaking from a Yoruba point of view. And I always appreciate that point of view when someone else, Ishakiri, speaks from that point of view. It brings a sense of, it tells you how vibrant and how essential it is to tell a story from that perspective of who we are and where we are coming from. So it was important that to get an editor who understands that. You know, yeah.
Talking about Yoruba, I really appreciated what you did with the Orakei, you know, how you kind of illustrated the beauty of the language, the musicality, and the poetry as well. And somehow I kind of felt like that kind of grounded prof and also might be a vehicle to healing as well, you know, like our archived memories, you know, in something like the Orakei.
When I was growing up, my grandmother would read Orakei to us whenever we do something.
For those who don't know what Orakei is,
It's a panegyric, like praise chant. That's what it is, you know. So she would recite it to us, and you know that's our way of getting paid, kind of. So she would recite it to us and tell us. So when Prof begins to have problems with his mom, the Orakei is a way of bringing him, taking him back to his origin. You know, there's this thing they'll say, remember the child of who you are, run to your moti wanshe, you know. So it's that idea, that remember who you are, remember the child of whom you are, remember the person you are. So reciting the Orakei is just a way of helping Prof return to his origin. So yeah, that's it.
I mean, what struck me about your book is the sadness weighing in on all characters and how despite their defiance and determination to survive and fight the system and all the injustice around them, they're still reminded of how small and how powerless they are. You know, and that is like something you see across the board, all over the continent. You know, there's like that feeling of immediate urgency towards change, and then, you know, we're always going to somehow return back to the status quo.
I could ask you a question in return. What do you
Playing the devil's
How do you
advocate.
feel during elections?
Excuse me?
How do you feel during elections?
I was depressed.
Seriously?
No, but you mean how I felt during
I
elections?
mean, generally, how do you feel when elections are conducted?
No, there's always a sense of excitement, and I partake in elections, obviously. Yeah.
Do you feel power? I mean, that you have power, that you
I
can really
feel
change?
till I go to the polling station, and then I see that they don't have the ballot sheets, or I see as somebody runs away with the papers or with the ballot booth or whatever they call it. Yeah, yeah.
So using that context,
Yeah.
that sense of going through the ballot station, feeling powerful and suddenly becoming powerless, you know, seeing that you have absolutely nothing and you will change nothing, you know, yeah. So that's that concept, and I mean, across Africa you can see it. The same people come back, you know, nothing really changes, really. So we are a people who we assume that we have power, but we are confronted with the fact that we are powerless.
Okay. Well, I'm just like, you know, just back to the book again. I just have to take this in. So, you tried, I mean, for a debut, this is quite ambitious what you did, because you're trying to tell so many stories and interweave them, you know, into one. How demanding was it for you? How long did the whole process take? I'm assuming you didn't even finish writing in Nigeria, because, I mean, writing here is extremely challenging, especially when you're working on a novel.
I mean, I finished it in Nigeria. Actually.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you ran to Canada, and
no.
then that's where you had it.
I finished it here, but it's been with my publisher for a while now. So I finished it while I was in Nigeria. And yes, it was challenging because I didn't have money, and I was so broke. And I then moved to a point when I thought I had money, and I had no time. You know, so yeah, and I was dealing with a whole lot of things. So, but seriously, dealing with the characters, it was difficult writing the characters because I was trying to write the people that I see, the people that I had become friends with people who fought for June 12th, and I had also become a part of a society. When I'm on a bus, you know, when I'm moving between, I see how disgruntled people are. I see the anger, and I was trying to put all of this in the book. It was quite frustrating, you know. trying to write the anger of a people in a book. And then there was a friend of mine, the Maroko story came in, that's Desire story came in because a friend of mine told me of when he was a child and the challenges they had after the place was demolished. And nobody talks about it really. A people, their home, their families, their lives suddenly ending, and it ended there. So I wanted to talk about those things as well. So I had so many things to talk about, but I needed to find a convergence, which is where Prof and Desire comes in.
So, when I was reading, going through your book, I kept on asking myself, because I've seen a lot of references to Fela, and I was just imagining, like, what was the soundtrack? What were you listening to? Because obviously I'm a musician, so I want to know, like, what is inspiring you in terms of music when you're working?
Blame my brothers. Blame my brothers.
Okay. Or do you even listen to music? I mean,
Of course I do. I do listen to music. But I think the Fela influence came from my brothers and then my dad also had a lot of LPs, it does. So we used to do on Fela's LPs, you have his lyrics, so we would sing and all of that. So there's this, consciousness that was a part of me from childhood. And it was just certain that Fela would be a part of anything I write, It was just there. Just the same way you find someone like a Sonny Ade as well. These were the influences of, like, my childhood influences.
And you just had, so you brought them all in and you channeled them as well.
Because writing typically borrows from everything that is a part of us. So when I'm in the process of writing, I'm telling their story, but I'm also borrowing from memories, things that essentially made me, and trying to put it on those characters. I'll borrow from the past, and I'll give it to them, and if they reject it, I'll take it back again.
So you've moved out of Nigeria, you're now in Canada. I wouldn't say you're in exile. Obviously, you're around.
I'm studying.
You're studying, okay. And now you're coming back home.
Yeah.
So how does that feel? I mean, how do you see Nigeria now from a distance?
Here or there, Nigeria is home. I'm passionate about Nigeria. I don't think Nigeria, nothing changes here. I have family here, I have friends here. I perpetually talk about Nigeria. I love Nigeria, even with all of its scars. When people ask me if I'm going to stay in Canada, I say I don't know. I love Canada as a place because it brought back my sanity. But I must also say that, my stories come from here. This is where I am. This is where I left Nigeria in my late 30s for study, and it took a long decision. My friends know how difficult that was for me. In the past, people have always pushed me to go on to get my degree outside of the country, but it was difficult because I'm someone who is always rooted. But there comes a time when you have to leave, when you have to hold on to what remains of you, and that's my sanity. A friend told me that he left before it disintegrated. He's talking about my sanity. And that time it was important I left. So yeah, Nigeria is home. And coming back here, I don't think anything has changed. It's still home, It's essentially where I love to be. I love people that I love, and I hate people that I hate.
You're now a mother, and I mean, even in exile, trying to preserve that Nigerianness, and trying to pass it on to your child. I mean, that makes you more aware of where you are.
I, I, I don't have any issue with that. I am very Nigerian. Believe me.
Without an apology.
Anywhere. I speak to my daughter. I speak Yoruba to my daughter in the mall. I don't have a problem with that. I was, you know, I don't have a problem with that at all. I think she's also a person on her own, and she's in a place where she's having to deal with living outside of that culture. So I'm not going to impose myself, but I'm going to tell her that this is who I am. And she knows that her mother is Nigerian. You know, there's a time my daughter was having a discussion with her when they come for play dates, and I was eavesdropping. And she said, my mom won't take that. You know, I don't know this accent thing. She's speaking Canadian things. And she said that I won't take that. I don't remember what they were trying to do. She said, I won't take that. She knows her mom, you know? And she's come to, I don't understand that. I don't think outside of your space, outside of the person that you are, I won't become someone else because I want to be foreign. I'm not. But my daughter is allowed to be what she wants to be because she's being influenced by Canadian culture. But she will remember that her mom is African, her mom is Nigerian, her mom is Yoruba. And that is a guiding light. You know, it's essential.
You've been exploring healing. I mean, that's obviously why you embarked on this journey with your novel. And how do you think we can get there? As individually, I mean, obviously as a society as well, but that individual trauma, how do we kind of like assist those that are in that space? People like the profs, the desires, and all the other characters.
Recognizing it.
Okay.
First. One of the first things you do when someone is traumatized is recognize and accept that they have a right to be traumatized. Recognizing it. We don't recognize it, you know. Perhaps we can start from there, recognizing that we're traumatized people.
Why do you feel we don't recognize it? Is it cultural? What do you think is the problem here?
Why don't we recognize that we're traumatized people? Because we don't know it. Sometimes when people are traumatized, they don't even know, when they are undergoing a trauma, they don't know that the event is a trauma at that time. So the thing is, maybe I should say that I don't know how we will recognize it. But I think it's important we recognize that we are traumatized people. We have a history of trauma, and we need to deal with it. Perhaps writing this sort of narrative and other narratives that have been written could help us, sensitize us. But generally, I think it starts from recognizing that we are traumatized people.
We've spoken so much about your book. Could you do us the favor and
I'm reading from it.
Reading from it?
I have a copy.
By the way, make sure you grab yourself a copy, right?
Yeah, try it. Okay. So, I'm going to read from. Yeah. Oops. Thank you. I was going to read from the first page, but I'm going to read from chapter 10. Okay. Or maybe let me give you a taste. I'm going to read the first chapter. Okay? Prof turned off all the lights in the house when he returned from prison. He bathed, cleaned, ate, and slept in the darkness which devoured the whole flat. When he did not have any cleaning or cooking to do, he would sit in his chair reciting passages from books he had memorized. He cooked his meals on an old kerosene stove whose red and yellow flames leapt out of the walled burner and lapped the sides of the steel pot. The light from the fire made him wince and mutter, "Ish, ish, ish." His house was not always dark as soot, because the one light of an electric bulb drifted in at night through the only window in the sitting room and sat on the arm of the chair opposite his. It irritated him. In the daytime, the heavy curtains his mother had covered the room in a thick shade, but could not prevent the sun's intrusion. The slight parting in the curtains allowed a thin stroke of light to fall on the floor of the sitting room. Prof tried, though, to keep in the darkness. He adjusted the curtains, but they always fell apart, inviting shadows to lay claim to new spaces in the room. It was dark, but never dark enough. Prof soon grew tired of aligning the curtains. He turned his attention to staring at the shadows which formed beside the furniture, moving around the house like a blind man born to his handicap, sensing when something was not in its rightful place. He regained confidence in knowing that the flat was as familiar with him as he was with it. He crept in and out of the rooms, floating like a paper lifted by the wind. Sometimes, he strayed into a room where he grazed an object, took note of the positioning, and counted the steps backward and forward to avoid eating the same object twice. As he moved from one room to another, filling spaces, he dreamt of dreadful ways in which his enemies, those who made him go to prison, will die. On the nights that his irritation filled the room, he defied his fear of the electric bulbs on the streets and took a long stroll along Jakande Estate. It was at these times that he bought kerosene or some foodstuff that he needed. Carrying an empty 4-liter jerrycan, he would brace himself with his praise names before leaving the house with a walking stick made from a rusty iron rod, which had once served as a cotton bar. He walked out onto the street, covered from head to toe like a woman in a buka, his ears catching distinct conversations in the mix of clamoring voices, car honks, and sometimes bleating goats finding their way home, alongside the music that bled from roadside CD-DVD kiosk. Prof stopped by one of the kiosks, defaced with campaign posters of the just concluded election, which had seen President Obasanjo elected for a second term. The poster that caught his attention was turned, and what was left of it was the lean face of Muhammadu Buhari, the name of Chuba Okadigbo, his ANPP running mate, and the words, will not do, it's a promise. Prof wondered what the lost words could be. After 10 years of absence, this was what he had returned to: 2 former military heads of state contesting for president. He tried to dismiss the thought of Nigeria's politics from his mind, but he could not. Obasanjo of the 70s contesting against Buhari of the 80s. And this is 2005, he blotted out. How can this country move forward when it seeks the dead to bring revival? People stared at him but turned away before their eyes met. It was often this way. People hurried ahead or crossed to the other side of the road once he turned to look at them. He was more interested in those who walked ahead of him in a pair or in threesomes, sharing neighborhood gossip or intimate stories. It was through them that he discovered his neighborhood was the black cauldron that cooked rumors for several other blocks of flats, lit with bright fluorescent lamps to Savo. Prof overheard one such rumor of himself and his flat on one of his infrequent night strolls. As he walked away from his home that day, he listened to 2 straw-thin teenage girls selling plantain chips tell the story of his life as they must have heard it. That is the home of the man I was telling you about, the bastard one that came back mad. Is it that professor, that uncle was talking about yesterday? Yes, his father was a landlord here before he died. Does the man even come out? Out. That is trouble for us in this neighborhood. If you go to his doorstep, you're as good as dead. Uncle said that if he kills, nothing will happen as he's a madman. He will be free of guilt. How does he live inside that place without coming out for lights? Uncle said he has iron bars on his doors and windows. How does Uncle know, Seth? What does he eat? I think he will only eat cockroach and rats. The girls took furtive glances at Prof's building, and then one tried to point towards it. The other one hit her on the shoulder to drop her hand. Stop it, don't point. What will happen if I do? Nothing. Just don't point to that madman's house. He could even be dead until his dead body begins to smell and council comes here. We can't even go near that place. Prof walked behind him. He listened with a little smile, sneaking into the corners of his mouth till it gave way to a small chuckle as the girls were already away. It was at this point that Desonya came to stand beside him. She often joined him on his excursions, and they would stand in front of the building to compare his flats to the others. His flat was noticeable, the way one notices a missing incisor tooth on a young woman. Prof observed the way the darkness of the flat established itself before the world around it. At these times, he would tell Desonya of how bothered he was that a little brightness encroached on the darkness of the area. Sometimes he told her of how, while standing outside, he considered what would become of him if light flooded the rooms. But once he stepped into the flat, the darkness in the room enveloped him, and he settled into it to brood over his past. Desonya left him at these times, evanescing from his thoughts the same way she came. That's chapter 1. Now, Bites, you read chapter 2, 3, 4. All right.
Brilliant sales pitch. Would like to open the floor for questions. You have the mic there? Okay, so that gentleman there has the mic, and please just identify yourself if you want to ask any questions. Okay. I don't.
Oh, thanks. Hi, my name is Chika. Congratulations, Jumoke, on your
Thanks.
novel, and well done. I get very jealous of poets who also write fiction. And so my question is coming out of a place of jealousy. So, would you consider yourself a writer or a poet?
Chika, that's unfair. Okay, I could say I'm a poet who writes novels. So I'm a poet who writes prose. Yeah. So that doesn't count. I think I'm just a writer, essentially. But I do love poetry, you know. I do love poetry.
Hold on, let's give you a mic. 1 second, sorry.
So, quick follow-up. So, do you find poetry easier to write than fiction, or they both present you with different set of challenges that are more or less equal?
I think that for me, they are different genres. For me, poetry is more like writing theory. It's about observation and trying to examine the context of things, trying to find meaning, you know. And for prose, I'm telling a story. I'm telling a story, but I'm borrowing from the language of poetry, you know. That's the way I say it. But for me, poetry is primarily like theory. You examine, you observe, you interrogate. You can do that with prose as well, but there are two different genres for me. Yeah.
Any other questions? I know it's very early in the morning. We're still trying to wake up. Oh. The mic will be with you shortly.
No spoilers, right? But the end. How did that end come to you, right? You know, did you just want to touch us?
Well, how do I make you buy my next book? Actually, start with this one. Start with this one. And then the next one, you know, you can expect something more.
Anyone else? Oh, okay. The young gentleman over there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nathaniel Bevan. I know you know that name. We've never met. So I write for Daily Trust. Prof, did you have to stay in a dark room?
That
write
was his
prof?
decision. You know, that was his decision, not mine. I would like to ask him the same question, really.
Okay, thank you.
Jumoke, I was going to ask you, pertaining to darkness, there's something final, scary, and yet fascinating about darkness. I'm sure it offered a lot of material for you to explore, both as a poet and obviously through the form of prose, right? I mean, that is like the best way to go about like this journey.
I think darkness is fascinating, you know. Not exactly, we think of it as scary, but it's fascinating to examine. And it provides a context and it provides a good metaphor for exploring the characters in the book. You know. Things get revealed in the dark. You know. You never know what will come out of it. So, yeah, it was fascinating having to interrogate the dark and see what the characters can make of the dark while writing the book. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Jumoke. We strongly advise you grab a copy of A Small Silence. It's outside for sale, I think. There's a bookstore outside, a pop-up bookstore.
Please, can we give Jumoke Verissimo and Ade Bantu a really big round of applause? Thank you very much.